Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Kelsey Schmitz. I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center at the University of Washington Smart Center, or the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. Thanks for joining us for our 5th webinar in our Creating Trauma Responsive Schools webinar series. Our topic today is support for teachers affected by trauma. We are a center that's funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Next slide, please. And because of that, we have this disclaimer that the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So as I mentioned, this is part of our Creating Trauma Responsive Schools series. Some of you have been with us since the beginning. Some of you may just be joining us for this webinar. We are starting to wrap up our series. If you have information, if you have an interest in the previous series, the webinars, you can go to our website that I think will be provided for you in the chat to watch the recorded webinars, to look at the previous presentations. And the webinar today is being recorded and will be posted soon on that website. We also want to draw your attention to a change that we're making for webinar 6. Based on our current situation with school closures, we've talked with our colleagues at the University of Southern California and have decided to change our topic to psychological first aid. So if you've already registered for that webinar and are still interested in that topic, we're just going to copy over the registration to this next webinar. We have also now have access to a webinar to support 500 registrants. So we'll be sending out the link, and you're welcome to invite your colleagues or other people that you work with who might be interested. Note that we have also changed the time for that webinar. So our webinar series have usually been at 11 Pacific time, and this one is going to be at 9:30, still on May 13th. If you do not want to attend this webinar and you've already registered for the 6th webinar, you can just shoot us an email and we can cancel your registration. So some of you who've been with us all along get to hear me talk again about the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. But I feel this is a very important piece of information to share with everyone. We are operating out of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center at the University of Washington. We serve the region 10, which is Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And we realize that there are several of you joining us today that aren't from our region, which is perfectly fine. And we welcome you all here to this event and any future events that we might have. But also want to make sure you're aware that in your own regions across the United States, you have a mental health technology transfer center that you can access for local support. Again, the great thing about this network is that you can access training, information, and support from any of these regions. If you're wanting more contextual support to your area, then I would recommend checking in with your school mental health lead in your region. The website for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network is located at the bottom of this slide. So we encourage you to check that out, check out your center, check out other centers. There is also a new resource page for COVID-19 resources that we would encourage you to take a look at, as each center is developing new resources to support you during the global pandemic. So here at our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, our school mental health supplement goals are to provide direct training and TA on the implementation of mental health services in schools, to build infrastructure and create learning communities, and to support educational leaders to promote mental health for all. So a huge shout out to our project staff. You may have been receiving communication from the amazing Megan Lucy, who's our program coordinator, and is doing a lot of the behind the scenes work for this webinar and many of our other webinars. And then a huge thanks to our awesome project director, Dr. Eric Brenz. So we welcome you to reach out and get in touch with us. This slide tells you how you can email Megan or myself, reach us by phone, or visit our website. You can also sign up for our newsletter. We send that out monthly. We're working on a special issue that'll go out later in April that has a lot of resources to support you during the global pandemic. So at this point, I want to introduce you to today's guest speaker. We are very honored to be joined by Dr. Steve Hayden. He's a clinical professor in field education and serves as the chair of the Pupil Personnel Services Credential Program at the University of Southern California. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. It's great to have you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Good morning, good afternoon, or perhaps good evening, depending upon where you might be calling from. And so as Kelsey mentioned, I'm Dr. Steve Hayden, and it's certainly an honor and pleasure to be with you today. And I'm glad you're here. This is a really important topic for me. I've had the exciting opportunity to work with many individuals in the profession of social work, but also in this kind of area of secondary traumatic stress. And so we're going to spend some time talking about secondary trauma today, and also spend some time looking at an online platform that I've worked with some other colleagues on regarding secondary traumatic stress and how it impacts teachers. I've also had the opportunity to be a consultant with the U.S. Department of Education, going out to different school districts, talking about compassion fatigue, trauma, resiliency, and an evidence-based intervention called psychological first aid, and something that we just learned about. But I've also given presentations to court interpreters and public defenders, first responders, and I'm sharing that with you because the concepts of secondary traumatic stress are not sort of confined to one particular discipline. It's actually something that can impact anybody in the helping profession. So I'm hoping that we're going to have some time to kind of think about that today as I move through my comments. So at this point in time, I'm going to stop the video so that we'll be able to focus more on the content of the slides, and then I'll turn my video back on towards the end of my presentation to answer any questions that you might have. My agenda for us today is to, the topic of today's webinar is STAT, the Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma online curriculum. But I think in order for us to think about secondary trauma, I wanted to kind of situate and frame you in some concepts around STS, why we might be at risk for STS, what are some signs that we might be experiencing secondary trauma, and then how that impacts us across multiple life domains. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about self-care and more than just, as one of my colleagues once said, more than just, eating broccoli and doing yoga. Like, I love broccoli, I love doing yoga, I used to do it when I was growing up, but we're really going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into self-care across some of the same domains that I'm using to describe the impact of secondary trauma. And then I will move into this online curriculum platform, and I'll actually show you the program and some different modules in the program so you can become familiar with some of its content. So if you were to sort of Google secondary traumatic stress, you would come up with a ton of different definitions and how it's operationalized, how we understand it. And so I'm going to give us a working definition. But before I do, I would just like to take just a moment to read to you this quote by Leonard Cohen. I think it's just very applicable to kind of the concepts of what we'll be thinking about today. And it says, "Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Okay, so forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So I invite you throughout my comments and throughout my presentation to just sit and reflect on some of the content, a quote such as this, some of the material, so we can begin again to frame ourselves and situate ourselves with the understanding of secondary traumatic stress and why we might be susceptible to that. So I love this quote and invite you to think about it a little bit as I move through today's webinar. The definition I'm going to use for secondary traumatic stress is that we work so intimately and closely with individuals that have experiences with trauma or hardship or devastation, that we actually start to take on some of what they're experiencing, right? With regards to depression, avoidance, loss of appetite, substance abuse. In fact, secondary traumatic stress is often chunked out into three primary categories: avoidance, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that, thought intrusion, and arousal. And that's because we really want to help the individuals that we're working with. And we believe in helping the individuals that we're working with. And so we do sometimes kind of pick up what it is that they're experiencing almost in a vicarious way. In fact, there's a concept out there called vicarious trauma. There's lots of sort of definitions or associated phenomena with secondary trauma, like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. We use some of these terminologies interchangeably, but they do have some subtle differences. Today, we're going to be focusing on secondary traumatic stress. The idea is that STS can happen to anyone, anywhere. And in fact, in some of the colleagues I've worked with, we've had some conversation about, is there a particular age range? And we're starting to learn and discover that there isn't, that you could sort of be really any age and experience these concepts of secondary traumatic stress. And it's important to understand that it's a great thing. It's not necessarily the weakness. Like it's a good thing that you're understanding that, wait a minute, something's impacting me. I'm doing my work differently. My relationships with others just seem to be strained or ruptured. I'm tending to avoid certain places or things, and that's not normal for me. And so I want to figure out what this might be about so I can identify it, attach some definition and some vocabulary around it so that I can do something about it. The last thing on the slide is compassion satisfaction. Some great research and literature a few years ago, well, more than a few years ago, about sort of compassion satisfaction, which posits that we derive so much kind of enrichment and joy from helping others who are in need, that we actually get satisfaction from it. We're compassionate and we want to do the work. We want to help people. We want to do good work. And so that's this kind of idea around compassion satisfaction. You can't talk about any of these concepts or phenomena without having a working understanding of resilience, right? And so when we think about resilience, sort of what are we thinking about, right? This ability to bounce back quickly and effectively from difficult circumstances. And that we want that bouncing back, even though it's unique and intimate to us, we want that bouncing back to kind of happen in a timely manner. Like we all, as humans, have the ability to be resilient through trying and troubling circumstances. And that eventually we kind of get back to this normal state of functioning. And then there's this idea out there about kind of post-traumatic growth. And this suggests that not only we bouncing back to kind of our normal way of doing things, but we actually experience positive changes in our personal and professional goals, our priorities, our relationships with others, sort of our outlook on life. And really interesting literature out there on post-traumatic growth. So let's talk a little bit about, why you may be listening to this webinar and thinking to yourself, why would I be at risk for secondary traumatic stress? So there's a few different concepts on this slide. One is this idea that we work so closely with others that we neglect or are unaware of our own feelings or our own needs, right? Perhaps we see ourselves in the work that we do with others. And I'm a social worker by heart and by trade. And one of the things we learn in Social Work 101 is countertransference. This sort of that the individual that we're working with reminds us of someone or something in our past life, or maybe even in our current life, that we resonate with, that we're kind of attached to or we're drawn into. Direct contact with children's stories, working with sort of children and adolescents is again one of the risk factors, because we want to help children and adolescents, right? They're sometimes a very vulnerable population. So listening to kind of the traumatic stories of the individuals, especially children and adolescents, may make us susceptible or put us at risk for secondary traumatic stress. And then empathy versus sympathy. I think, we sort of have a good understanding of being empathetic is a good thing. You're sort of, identifying and understanding someone else's feelings and thoughts or situation versus feeling sorry for someone. So it's okay to be empathetic, but coupled with some of these other risk factors may make us vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. And if you are experiencing some of these, it doesn't mean STS will sit in. You could just be having a bad day or a rough week, a rough patch, and that's okay. But sometimes it may mean that we might be experiencing secondary trauma. So it's a good thing to kind of understand that in the work that you're doing, I could be at risk for secondary trauma. So then what would be some signs, right? So now I've sort of helped you understand maybe a working operational definition of secondary trauma and why you might be at risk in the very nature of the work that you're doing. But what are some things to maybe look for? One is this kind of intense connection to those that you help. You not only care about the person you're working with, but you are overly invested in making sure he or she is okay. In other words, like this person can't make it without you. And the way I look at this is it's okay to stay connected to the process of helping, but maybe not attached to that process of helping. That you're highly irritable, maybe short-tempered, or little things sort of get to you. So whereas before you had the patience to work with a particular student in your classroom or a client on your caseload, now that particular student is just sort of bothered, you're irritable, or you don't have the patience to sit down and work through whatever that student or client might be needing some help with. That you're pushing yourself too hard, that there's so much need out there that you can't afford to take time away from yourself, that you feel like you have to do it all. Like the work won't get done unless you're the sole person that's going to be working on this project. And while you might have the talents to be that sole person, when we don't allow others to help us and work on a team, sometimes that work can suffer. You may have feelings of experience low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy, or conversely, you might have feelings of grandiosity. Okay, lack of focus, inability to concentrate, or perhaps even developing symptoms similar to PTSD, sleep disturbances, intrusive thoughts, feelings of being sad, frightened, maybe over anxious, or even disconnected. And we're going to get into that in the next couple of slides on the impact of secondary trauma. And again, as I mentioned in the definition, sort of isolating yourself, avoiding certain places that are reminders of some of the stories you heard with some of the children or adolescents that you've been working with. So they might share with you a story about a bullying incident in a particular part of campus. And so maybe maybe that was in the playground or in a parking lot. And so you might avoid that place because it just is a stark reminder of the story that you heard from one of the students that you were working with. So I'm gonna stop here for a second. And I'm just going to invite you to just spend just a minute or so reflecting on some of the content that I've already shared, maybe digesting it a little bit and thinking to yourself, yeah, this has impacted me, or some of those signs or some of those risk factors are applicable to me. So I'm gonna just pause for just a minute or so, just to allow you to reflect on some of this. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping that you're spending a little bit of time thinking about this and if it's sort of applicable to you. The next couple of slides are going to walk us through the impact of secondary traumatic stress, and I'm going to do that over 7 different sort of what I call life domains. The first impact is emotional. So there's basically 4 human emotions: mad, sad, glad, and scared. I know if you're working in schools, we have those kind of feeling charts, and there's like 100 different images of smiley faces or faces with frowns, or shocked faces that we show our kids. But and I understand that, right? I used to work in schools, but really they do somewhat boil down to kind of these 4 basic human emotions, right? Mad, sad, glad, and scared. And secondary traumatic stress can enhance these emotions with feelings of being overwhelmed, powerless, maybe even hopeless, right? On the slide here, it sort of describes us as feeling numb or detached, perhaps living in denial. There's a physical impact, having low energy, fatigued, upset stomach or nausea, perhaps difficulty sleeping or feeling dizzy. Behavioral impact, you sort of change your routine of things. Your experience with your behavior towards others at work or at home changes. Some more severe behavioral impacts are perhaps the use of self-destructive coping mechanisms like drugs or alcohol, excessive gambling, excessive shopping, right? So we have to be, I'm not saying you can't shop. I'm not saying you can't, do some of these other ways that you deal with stress, but it's just when it's in moderation. And when we start to do that and rely on that as a sole coping mechanism, could be counterproductive. And another impact of secondary trauma, the professional impact, right? That you might experience low performance on job tasks and responsibilities. Your morale on the job can be low, or your relationships with colleagues might even suffer, or you might just bring an attitude to work every day. I'm gonna go on to the next slide, and then I'll invite you to sort of share some thoughts about how this may or may not be something that you've thought about and that has impacted you. The cognitive impact, you might experience confusion, diminished concentration, decreased self-esteem, self-doubt, blaming others. You may become hypervigilant or experience what we call trauma imagery, which is seeing events over and over and over again. If I'm hoping that one of the things you're picking up on here is that the STS can impact us both professionally on the job and in that work that we do, but also personally in our home environments, in our ability to have, healthy, positive relationships with others around us. And so there is an opportunity here to kind of think and reflect about, this does impact not only my work life, but it also impacts some of my home life. And particularly now that we're sort of living amongst this global pandemic and we're all kind of sequestered, I make the assumption that most of you are from states where you kind of have these stay-in-home shelters orders in place. I do. And so your work is kind of blending with your personal life. And so STS can impact you now in kind of a different way because we're kind of contained in this one space, and some of that can spill over, and the boundaries can blend sometime or become a little bit murky. There's a spiritual impact. Sometimes we don't often talk about the spirituality of things or the spirituality of some of these conditions or phenomena. And so this sort of indicates that you might question the meaning of life. Feel you have lost a sense of purpose in the world. You may have a lack of self-satisfaction or become angry at a higher power or even question your religious or spiritual beliefs. And ironically, it's oftentimes that spirituality in us that might get us through a difficult, pressing or challenging time. And so we rely on whatever that higher calling is for us, whatever that is for you, and however you want to define that is intimate and personal for you. And that's great. But sometimes STS can impact sort of that thinking and that understanding of things. And then there's the interpersonal impact, right? Becoming physically unavailable, emotionally withdrawing from coworkers or family. You may have a decreased interest in intimacy or physical touch. You might isolate yourself from family, friends, or support systems, or maybe even become impatient or intolerant of others or the situations around you. So similarly to my earlier couple of slides, I'm gonna stop here and invite you to just sort of, again, breathe for a moment and reflect on some of the content that I'm sharing, and maybe think about how this might be impacting you or a coworker or a friend that also might be struggling with some of this. Okay. So I did my best in kind of a brief introduction to sort of what is secondary traumatic stress, and again, sort of attaching some understanding vocabulary. When we don't know something, we sometimes avoid it, and we're afraid of it, and it's scary to us, and so we just completely avoid it. And so the idea here is I've done these presentations before, and I talk with individuals, and they'll say, I don't know what secondary traumatic stress is, but as you describe it, yes, now I know what that is. And as you describe why I might be at risk, yep, that makes sense to me. As you describe some of the impact factors, right, or the symptomology of it, yeah, that I can resonate with. So I didn't know it was called secondary traumatic stress. I thought it was just stress or trauma. I think sometimes it helps people to differentiate the meaning and the understanding of it. And then they can start to maybe get behind the fact that, yep, this might be something that I've experienced, and I understand why I might be experiencing it. Now I know kind of what it looks like, how to interpret it. And now it'd be nice to know sort of what are some things I might be able to do about that, because trauma is inevitable. It's going to happen in all of our lives, and we're going to listen to traumatic stories in the moving forward. There's always, and now again, we're going through this pandemic, and I imagine some of you have been thinking about, now we're kind of in this sort of global traumatic event. And so I think it's a good thing to have some awareness of that and some kind of conceptual understanding of what is secondary traumatic stress. And now I'd like to invite us to think about these ideas around self-care, right? I've done a lot of research about what are some ways to either mitigate or minimize the impact or even prevent the onset of secondary traumatic stress. And a couple of things have popped up in the literature. One is this way of kind of thinking about self-care. And again, I'm going to show you a couple of slides on the different domains of self-care. But we've had some really interesting conversation recently about concepts around organizational self-care and how our organizations and schools or school districts sort of providing the avenues or the mechanisms for staff and faculty to engage in self-care activities right there in a school setting, right? There's been a lot of work out there so far around trauma-informed schools. And I think there was a webinar earlier about trauma-informed schools. And trauma-informed schools are schools where everybody, top to bottom, everybody from side to side. So whether you're a principal, you're a teacher, you're a clerical staff, you're a coach, you have an idea of that trauma is real, that it impacts everybody uniquely and intimately. And it's not up to us to determine the level of impact trauma can have. Trauma is intimate and personal for the individual experiencing it, and it's really important to understand that. But along with this concept of trauma-informed schools is this idea of perhaps of these kind of schools that engage and believe and subscribe to this notion of self-care and being aware of how important that is. And there are some ways that we can do that. So let's explore that a little bit. So I'm going to talk about these different domains of self-care, and I'm going to kind of go through each of these. And if you'll notice that some of these self-care domains are the very same domains that I reflected on when we thought about the impact of secondary traumatic stress. So for me, Mike, if we're going to talk about the impact of secondary trauma, then let's talk about how we can take care of ourselves in some of those same domains. So the first one is physical, right? Recognizing the need for physical activity, proper diet, sleep. Okay, there's research out there on the amount of sleep we need, right? If you turn on Good Morning America or CNN or whatever your go-to station is, they'll say, oh, there's a new study that says you need 8 hours of sleep. No, I guess you only need 6 hours. Well, we know you need more than 1 hour, right? And so this important need to have some proper sleep. Intellectual self-care. Recognizing the ways to expand knowledge and skills, training. The very fact that you're here today in this webinar is an example of intellectual self-care. In a moment, I'm going to get into some of the barriers in self-care. And one of those barriers is you just don't have time, right? Well, you made the time today and you're here. And this is an example of intellectual self-care. So congratulations. I mean, think about what would happen if we were not intellectually stimulated for long periods of time, right? And so we want to always be thinking and exercising our minds in thoughtful, creative ways. Environmental self-care, ensuring that you're occupying pleasant and stimulating environments that support well-being and good health. And again, I realize now that we're kind of in this global pandemic. And so we're a bit confined to what those environments are permissible. But at the same time, you can go outside. You might find a corner of the house that's yours. We have been joking with colleagues about, my wife books one room and I book another room, and then we stay out of each other's way to get our work done. Take the kids out in the backyard. But eventually, once this pandemic is over, the concept around the environmental self-care is getting outdoors and enjoying, life outside, and again, these pleasant and stimulating environments that help support well-being and good health. Emotional self-care, right? Understanding ways to manage and cope with stress. I mean, think about what would happen if we didn't develop coping mechanisms to help us deal with the concepts of stress and secondary traumatic stress. So this idea that we want to understand and manage better ways to kind of cope with stress. And so if we're doing something that's somewhat destructive or not as productive, I can't sit here and tell you not to do that, right? I talk with my students. I teach classes as you mentioned, at University of Southern California, and I talk to my students about in the social work, the social work program. I talk to my students about, listen, if we're going to ask a client to stop doing something, whether it's alcohol abuse or substance abuse, then we have to provide them an outlet within the resources available to do something different. We have to help them understand maybe a different, better way of coping with a stressful situation. Okay, we have social self-care. As humans, listen, we might want to spend time alone. That's perfectly okay. To sort of say, hey, I just need 5 minutes, 10 minutes on my own, and then I can be here and be with you. But as humans, we eventually want to be around and connected to people whom we love and whom love us. That's just kind of our social sort of way of being. And whether that's a loved one, a family member, a good friend, a good colleague, whoever that might be for you, we want to be around them and spend time with them. And again, just to go back to kind of where we are right now, we're physically distancing ourselves, but hopefully you're still staying socially connected. I know I am. On Easter Sunday, my family, my family lives in Massachusetts for most of them. And so we all kind of connected, virtually, and we still felt socially connected, even though we were isolated from one another. So now more than ever, we want to find ways to make sure we're spending good quality time with the individuals who we enjoy being around. The spiritual self-care, the ability, so I talked about the impact of STS on the spiritual side. The spirituality is sort of the ability to search for meaning and purpose in the human experience, okay? And then I apologize, I'm just noticing on my slide here, there's two emotional, so I'll have to get that changed. But the occupational side of self-care is, what I'm thinking about here and what we mean here is obtaining personal satisfaction and enrichment derived from our work, right? Really enjoying the work that we do. I'm fortunate enough where I love my job. I love the colleagues I work with. I love the classroom instruction. I love, thinking about creative ways of disseminating curriculum. And it's just, I have an opportunity to do webinars like this. I really, really enjoy that. And so finding these, enriching satisfaction in the work that you're doing. And then thinking about, gosh, are you working in kind of a dysfunctional or toxic environment? And if that's over a long period of time, we have to think about that and change some of that. So we have sort of these ideas around self-care, but then we have these barriers, right? We think about how can we avoid these barriers, kind of climb over these barriers, if you will, and move into successful ways that we can manage and take care of ourselves. So the first barrier here is guilt, right? Feeling guilty that you're giving time away from yourself. That you're taking time for yourself and you're not applying that time to others. But remember, that's one of the risk factors, right, for secondary trauma, that we spend too much time helping others, that we're not taking the time for ourselves, right? And we feel guilty about that. So that's a barrier. Motivation, right? You have to be, so I think about motivation in kind of a more, in kind of a unique way here. And one is, I've got up here choice, knowledge, and persistence. So choice is kind of the active choice. We actually have to actively decide, okay, that we're going to engage in some type of self-care routine or habit. And so if we're not deciding we're going to do that, then we're missing a key ingredient to this concept of motivation. A knowledge, or what we might refer to as mental effort, that we're actually thinking about new ways to do self-care that maybe we haven't thought of, or we've been applying mental effort to doing self-care and it just hasn't really been working, hasn't been successful. And then persistence, which is kind of that grit, that getting up the 10th time when you've fallen down 9 times. And so the thinking about motivation, active choice, mental effort, and persistence. And then time. When we say, wow, we don't have the time for self-care. For me, I think about self-care as making it routine and habitual. It should be something that you're doing the same way you talk on your cell phone, the same way you brush your teeth in the morning, the same way, you say goodbye to a loved one. Self-care should just kind of be part of your normal routine of things. And don't feel like the self-care you have to work on in all these different domains. You might attempt to kind of do one thing for a week and see how that goes. Or you might do a couple of different things. Like if you go for a walk outside and, maybe you go with a loved one. So, but you're practicing your social distancing, okay? That's 2 different types of self-care. It's environmental, but it's also physical and it's social. So it's actually 3 different types of self-care. So I ask you to not think about self-care in these kind of overwhelming, long-term goals, but maybe you break it down in kind of measurable, meaningful goals that are within sort of the resources available. And that's a segue into the last piece on this slide, which is contracting with others. So you might decide that, I'm going to engage in a self-care routine and plan, but I want somebody to kind of hold me accountable. So I'm going to ask a good friend to say, hey, listen, I just built kind of a self-care plan, and I'm going to commit to reading a chapter in my favorite book during the next month. And in a month, I want you to reach out to me and say, hey, Steve, did you read the chapter? And like, yeah, actually I did. Great. How was it? And, oh, gosh, I didn't get to it. Like, okay, it's okay. What got in the way and what can we do to remove that impediment so you can really get that chapter read that you promised yourself. So that's kind of this notion of contracting with others. The significant others is sort of making sure that the people around you know that you're engaging in kind of maybe a new self-care regime, or you're going to continue with the self-care that you're already doing. And so it's important that you're getting the support from others just so that they're aware of it, or maybe you might want them to join you in some of the activities. The family and I took a walk last night at 8 o'clock at night just to kind of get outside. And it was a little bit cooler out here in Los Angeles. It was kind of hot yesterday. So in the evening time, it cooled off, and that was my significant others, is kind of going through a small walk in the neighborhood. Group work, and here's kind of this area where we think about maybe organizational self-care, and can groups of faculty or staff do something together, whether it's a potluck supper, whether it's a staff training, whether it's a walk in the neighborhood prior to going to school, doing something with others, and that makes you feel good, makes you feel healthy, makes you feel like you're a better self. Because if you're not your best self, you're not going to be your best self every day. I know that. But if we're not kind of regularly our best self, then we're not able to do the really good work that we want to do, right? And so that's why I really stress the importance of self-care. And then again, I think I talked a little bit about making sure your self-care goals are measurable, and so that they're time-bound and there's someone responsible, and that they're manageable. That if you're going to say, I'm going to start jogging, 2 times a week, do you have a place to jog? Do you have comfortable, running shoes and sneakers? And so that's what we mean by kind of, manageable within the resources available for you. Again, I'm going to stop there and just invite you to kind of think a little bit about self-care before I move on to the next slide, and then I will get into the STAT program. Okay, so thank you for that, and I hope that when we're having these pauses, you're thinking about what we've talked about, what I've been talking about, and you're spending some time understanding the importance of, at this for this particular portion of the presentation, self-care. And if you're not doing it, really examine and explore why, and what are some things you can do to get back into your self-care routines or to maintain those self-care routines. This slide, I'm just going to breeze through. I was at a presentation by Dr. Rosenstein, who's one of the associate vice provost here at USC, and she talked about these 5 pillars of thriving, and I thought it was really kind of cool how she looked at it. And so the first one, positive emotions, and sort of talking about and describing how we great ways to kind of handle and accept the emotions that we're experiencing, and to not be hard on ourselves, but to actually be gentle with ourselves and to understand where our emotions are coming from. Engagement, and sort of engaging with others, and having kind of meaningful, positive relationships with the people that we work with, that we live with, that we play with, and ascribing meaning to what we're doing, and then accomplishing tasks, whether those tasks are great or those tasks are small. So there's actually some, again, research and literature. I'm an academia, so I'm always going to reference, well, there's articles and empirical studies, but I thought she did a nice presentation with these 5 pillars of thriving. And so I told her I was gonna steal that and insert it into my my presentation. So now I'm going to move into STAT, and I'll tell you a little bit about kind of what this is and how it got started. A few years ago, as I mentioned, I was working with the U.S. Department of Education and doing some trainings around concepts around a similar phenomenon, which is compassion fatigue, and kind of that weariness and dreariness that sets in, that because we're very compassionate about the individuals that we work with, but that can cause us to become fatigued. And in these trainings, these are co-trainings at various school districts, I was realizing that, wow, these concepts are very real, and they're actually impacting, school personnel in a unique and different way. And I thought to myself, I'm in academia, I'm a social worker by heart. I feel like I want to try to build something that can help individuals get through what it is they might be experiencing. And so I convened a group of, at the time, kind of some national experts in the fields of, secondary traumatic stress. And we had like a one-day kind of work think tank, if you will, here at USC. And we came up with this idea about, well, why can't we build an online program that's going to be user-friendly, something that people can do whenever they have the time, that asks people to think about some of the topics that many of the topics that I just mentioned. So what's the definition and understanding of that? Why are we at risk for secondary trauma? Kind of how does it impact us? So I'm going to walk you through some of these modules and some of the content. So that means I'll be toggling back and forth and sharing my screen between the slide deck and the actual STAT program. So bear with me as I sort of jump through this. I presented this content at a school mental health conference in Austin, Texas in the fall, and I had an IT guy right there helping me through it. And I would just say, oh, go to this slide, and he would, and go to the program, and he would, and it was very seamless. So don't expect that seamlessness, if you will, but I'll do my best. On here are all the different partners that we worked with. This was about a 3-year project that was funded by SAMHSA. I'm part of a Trauma and Services Adaptation Center, which is part of the larger National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. And so I partnered with colleagues of mine at the USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work, 3C Institute, which was kind of our technology partner, all the different graphics and designs. That's all their kind of talents and wisdom. Partnered with a colleague of mine at University of Montana, UCLA, and RAND Corporation. And so we all kind of worked, like I said, built a curriculum in all the language and all the different graphics and the ideas and concepts over, like I said, about a 3-year period. And in case I don't forget, the STAT program is free. It's available for anybody. You log in, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And then you create your own user profile. and that's yours, and it's kind of yours forever. And you can go in at any point in time and look at the program and walk through the modules. The other thing is that in a lot of adult learning platforms, you sort of have to take the modules sequentially. So you have to do one and finish one before you get to two and finish two. Well, STAT, we designed a little bit different. The first module, you do have to get through. That's a kind of a mandatory module because it gives you a definition and an overview of how what is STS and how it differentiates from other types of trauma or associated phenomena. But after that module, while it's ideal that you walk through each module in order, you might jump around a little bit, and that's perfectly okay, because we realize that some of the participants who are going to be taking the program might already have some understanding about risk factors for secondary trauma. So they really want to get to kind of measuring or assessing where their STS levels are. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. So in this first module, so there are 5 modules. In this first one, it's kind of an overview of secondary traumatic stress and sort of what are some of the symptoms that we might be looking for if we're experiencing secondary trauma, okay? So I'm not going to play any part of that module, but I will now get into module 2. And module 2 does a real deep dive into the risk factors, student populations, personal characteristic traits, and the school environment. So here's my first attempt to share a new screen with you to look at this particular module. Hold on just a second. So I'm going to play this for you.
In Module 1, we learned about the concept of secondary traumatic stress, STS, and its associated symptoms, such as nightmares, problems concentrating, avoidance of places or things that recall the trauma, and negative changes in mood. In this module, we'll build on what we've discussed by looking at risk factors that make teachers especially vulnerable to developing STS. As we discussed in Module 1, trauma exposure can be very common, averaging about 60% nationally. In some schools, that number is far higher. Teachers are in a unique position to develop trusting relationships with students, so it's likely that at some point, a student who has or is currently experiencing trauma will turn to us for support or comfort. Although hearing about these traumatic events doesn't always result in the development of secondary traumatic stress, it dramatically increases the odds that we will experience at least some symptoms of STS. So it's important to understand the risk factors specific to our profession and to us as individuals. The 3 risk factors we'll discuss here relate to the student populations we teach, our personal characteristics, and the school environments in which we work. At the conclusion of this module, you'll be able to recognize the specific risk factors relevant to your workplace, as well as the personal character traits that may make you vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress.
Jump ahead here. And so what we've tried to do is ensure that this module is not just didactic, like the whole program is not just didactic. So we have a series of interactive activities, and this is kind of a drag and drop one where you would sort of, I've already populated this, but when you're brand new to the program, you could do this on your own. And so this one just sort of says, what are some of your personal characteristics that are relevant to you? And so you kind of can drag and drop and plug these in here. And then at the end of this module, there's a form that actually populates with your personal characteristics and perhaps your character traits. And so you'll be able to download that form and you can kind of take that with you. And then you might jump into the program a couple months later and decide that, maybe those personal characteristics are slightly changed or enhanced. And maybe it might be time to kind of revisit some of these factors that are relevant to me. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit more. And here's one on the work environment. And can you sort of, you drag over and you literally just drag and drop I'm going to show you, we've got some teacher vignettes here with some sort of cases that you can kind of analyze and think about what is it that this teacher might be going through. And then we actually have some live, well, recorded, but actual teachers that we filmed in Washington, D.C. when we were down there for a conference. And we actually filmed them talking about how STS impacts the teacher and ways that they take care of themselves. And I think I've got a place where I can show you some of that. But here again, just kind of an interactive experience where you can drag over some factors that relate to you. And then again, in circle number 10 here, 10, and here's where those items would be populated, right? So the factors relevant to you, and so you've got the student populations, and so this first one here is students who have recently experienced a traumatic event, students experiencing some other kind of trauma, your personal characteristics. I have difficulty making time for my self-care, right? That's a big one, okay, folks? And then school environment. Maybe my school encourages working through lunch, right? We want to take the time to have our lunch, and I'm guilty of that too. I eat at my desk, or I might be heading to a meeting off campus, and I just kind of eat in the car, and that's not good. We want to take some time to spend some time, eating our lunch, digesting our food, even if that's with others, and then just enjoying that kind of self-care activity. And believe me, I believe in the whole eating right. Or at least eating. If you noticed at the beginning of my presentation, my video was on, and there's a eat sign right behind me. So that lets you know that I'm a believer in taking that part of my self-care regime or routine. And then right here, this blue arrow allows you to kind of download the actual PDF. And so you can take it with you, and you can have that with you, okay? So I'm gonna stop that. And module 3 looks at the assessment of secondary traumatic stress. And this is so in this module, participants can assess their own levels of secondary trauma by using a tool that we call the MyStat level. And MyStat level, I'm going to show you what this scale looks like. And it's a really great opportunity for you to not only do it once, right? So you can kind of assess your levels of secondary trauma according to, there's a scale out there in the public domain, developed by Dr. Brian Bride and others. He's actually a good friend and colleague of mine, the STS scale. And it looks at secondary trauma in kind of these three, chunked down into these 3 categories: intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. So let's take a look at this for a little bit here. And you can do this scale up to 3 times. So you're encouraged to sort of do this once, and then encouraged to do this maybe halfway through the year, or maybe if you've experienced some type of traumatic event, and then maybe do it at the end of the year. Okay, so let me show you what this one looks like.
MyStat level uses a version of a common STS questionnaire created by Brian Bride and his colleagues. We've adapted Dr. Bride's questionnaire for use by teachers and other school staff. It comprises 17 items that ask about common symptoms of STS. Your MyStat level score will correspond to one of 5 colors, each of which represents the severity of STS you are experiencing. To gain further insight into options for self-care, please refer to Module 5. The green level means that you have little or no STS at this time. For teachers at the green level, we recommend retaking MyStat level once per year, or sooner if you have a secondary traumatic experience with a student or someone else. The blue level indicates that you have mild STS. We suggest retaking MyStat level at the end of this school year or sooner if you have a secondary traumatic experience with a student or someone else.
So I'm going to stop there. You can see where she's going with this, right? So the green level kind of really, you're not really experiencing secondary trauma at this time. Blue, mild, and then yellow, orange, and red kind of gets us to this sort of severe level. I'm going to play this piece here. And so here, you can sort of take the stat questionnaire and sort of, you could, like I mentioned, you can do this up to 3 times. After that, the program doesn't sort of clean itself out, so you could do this again. So the one thing you might want to do is just download a blank MyStat level. And so you will have that available to you for future sort of times that you might want to take it. We talked a lot with the developers and 3C and just the functionality of that. It was a bit too challenging. And so but at the same time, you will be able to see kind of, if you will, either, I don't know about a trajectory, but kind of where you fall into your areas of assessing your secondary trauma at 3 different points in time. And then here's where, so for the very first one, like the other sort of modules, as you enter items in, they get populated into kind of a final product that you're able to see. So for this particular one, when I did this, it looks like I did it on, December 10th of 2018. My stat level was at a 45. So I was kind of in this orange category, right? So that means I've got some thinking to do about STS, maybe talking with some others, re-examining sort of how I'm approaching my work, beginning to think about how I'm taking care of myself, maybe taking advantage of, seeking some counseling or some outside support. Okay. And it also chunks it out into like where my component levels were. So I was kind of about the same level in intrusion. So intrusion is thought intrusion, thinking of things over and over again, even disruptive sleep patterns, right? Avoidance, I think I've already talked about, avoiding places or even talking about, what it is you might be experiencing. And then sort of being highly aroused, hypervigilant, irritable, and these concepts around arousal. And so this program, and we actually sort of used Brian Bride's and others, the STS scale, to look at sort of the fidelity of it and where somebody would score in order to be at a high level of STS. And so when we calibrated that, this sort of 44 to 48, I believe, was where the numerical range we fell in, or the threshold, if you will, that indicated that we are probably in high area of STS. And then the program sort of gives you some ideas about what you might want to do if you're in this particular level. Okay, so there's just 2 more levels, and then I'm going to end with you today. The 4th level is the impact of secondary traumatic stress. And then this level, we do explore kind of the impact of STS across the life domains that I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the occupational, spiritual, cognitive, physical, social, and there's another one in there that it's escaping me. Well, maybe we'll see it. And so again, so now we've talked about, the definition and understanding, that's module 1. Module 2, kind of why we might be at risk and what are some signs to sort of look for. And then we sort of ask a participant, if you're going through sequentially, we ask you to stop and assess. Now you have an understanding of STS, you can kind of relate to it, you've got some language and vocabulary around it. Let me kind of do my own assessment of where I might be in levels of secondary traumatic stress. And now we talk with you about how that might impact your work and your ability to do your work well. And this would be in module 4, so how STS impacts teachers. I'm actually going to look at
Secondary traumatic stress can make it more difficult to regulate our emotions. Situations we would know.
So here, I'll play this, but here, again, I just happened to click on the emotional domain. And so there's actually this type of interaction in each of the 6 domains that we sort of present or highlight in this module. I'm just choosing to walk you through the emotional domain.
Normally move through easily or react to with mild sadness, irritation, or anxiety can start to feel overwhelming. We may become hypersensitive to others' comments and feel criticized, or we may have excessive worries, even though we rationally know we shouldn't be worried. We may find that minor problems or disagreements make us disproportionately angry, leading to arguments with family, friends, coworkers, or even a cashier at the local market. We may dream about the traumatic experiences our students have shared with us, or find our waking thoughts returning again and again to the events they've described. Everyday events and actions may start to remind us of these traumas, such as witnessing a negative interaction between a parent and a child, passing by a place where we know a traumatic event occurred, or hearing a story that brings the traumatic experience to mind. These sorts of mental intrusions can in turn cause other problems, We may have trouble concentrating or fully engaging in activities we normally enjoy. We may find ourselves fixating on trying to solve our students' problems. Difficulty coping with these uncomfortable emotions, particularly if we don't fully understand why we're experiencing them, may lead to misuse of alcohol or drugs in an attempt to self-medicate. 2 weeks ago, one of Robin's students shared that her father had started an argument with her mother and shoved her against a wall. The student was worried for her mother and unsure what to do. Robin reported her student's situation to the proper authorities. Robin usually prides herself on welcoming constructive feedback about her work, but in the weeks since her student confided in her, she's been brought to tears more than once by suggestions left on walkthrough forums and is beginning to feel overwhelmed by her daily duties. She especially dreads the end of the day when all of the teachers lead their students downstairs to the auditorium to wait for their parents. The noise level grates on her nerves, and she finds herself frantically scanning the space for faces she doesn't recognize, fearful that someone will enter the auditorium intending to hurt students or staff members. At home, Robin has been uncharacteristically irritable with her husband and has started drinking several glasses of wine at night to cope with her feelings of anxiety.
Okay, so the rest of that module, I jumped ahead a little bit. The rest of that module then will ask you to sort of think about what you just listened to in that teacher vignette, in this case, Robin, and how was she being impacted by a secondary trauma. And again, it's kind of a drag and drop. And if you get the answer right, it says yay or yes, or I think correct in green. If you get the answer wrong, then it says incorrect and please try again. So we did find that to be more interactive, for someone to find the program much more engaging, we wanted to have kind of these different experiences. And we also have some places where you can actually type in and journal for yourself what you might be experiencing with the impact of secondary trauma. And likewise with the other modules, you can sort of download that journal and keep it with you. As promised, I shared with you that there are some actual teacher interviews for purposes of our time together today. I won't be able to show you one here, but there are 3 teachers and they all have these sort of interviews that talk about the impact of STS, their understanding of it. And then in the 5th module, which is self-care, they talk a little bit about the ways that they take care of themselves. So really, they were fantastic, and they just really were spot on with a lot of the content that we find has resonated with users. And I say that because we did some pilot testing of the STAT program during the fall and even last spring and summer. And we had some great, reports back and some feedback. And one of the highlights were the teacher interviews that of everything in the program. They really liked the content. They thought it was helpful to give them a great and a good, and even in some ways, a deep dive into STS. But they also really resonated with the teacher interviews because they connected with their stories. And then the last module I'm going to share with you, and the last module in the program is module 5. So module 5 is looking at sort of self-care again across these different life domains. And here participants have an opportunity through drag and drops and teacher interviews. They look at the barriers to self-care and helps them understand ways to take care of themselves. And then you have the opportunity to craft and build your own self-care plan based on this kind of SMART goal sheet, if you will, that you can download and take with you, contract with someone, share, with a significant other. You have the opportunity to maybe revisit your self-care goals. You might learn about a new way, right? That mental effort, a new way to do something through a friend, a colleague, or something that you researched online. And so you think about a different SMART goal for yourself in order to take care of yourself. So I'm gonna jump into this platform one last time so I can share with you some of the content in this particular module. So here, if I were to click on each one, you would learn more about each of these different concepts. Because I'm hoping I walked you through different ways to take care of ourselves from an occupational perspective, an emotional perspective. I'm not going to jump into one of these, but you would essentially hear some ideas and the narrator talk about the different ways we take care of ourselves across each of these life domains. I am going to jump ahead, however. Yes, so what would happen here is you actually would be able to fill in, you'd actually be able to fill in your self-care plan, and then you can hit, there's a circle here, and I want to see if I can find this.
Now, think about any barriers that might prevent you from sticking to your self-care plan.
Right. So she goes on to talk about, ways that you might be impeded by or successfully accomplishing your self-care plans and your goals, and does a much richer description than I did in my earlier remarks, but to the same point about ways that we don't want to feel guilty, even though we know that's there, taking the time, making sure that we build it into kind of our routine or our daily way of conducting our work. Yeah, and here's where you would begin to kind of enter in your SMART goals for each of the self-care activities that you like to do. And then there's a, one of the slides in this module has a physical file, and it literally is it's like a folder, and you click on that folder and you're able to download your self-care plan. Okay, the last, so real quick, so what we have here, we do have a completion certificate. So when you're done, you've got something, you can begin this, and you fill it out, and it's something that you can take to your administrator or to a colleague and say, hey, look, I did this and I have this completion certificate. So you have that. We've got some resources here that are available for you, and they just talk about hotlines and referrals, organizational assessments. Here's a STS organizational tool developed by Ginny Sprang and others. Again, a good friend and colleague of mine. And so there's some really great resources in here. And then on here, you can kind of sort, what you want to, what do you want to look at? So I don't really want to see it all. I'm really interested about mental health or suicide prevention. Wouldn't mind looking at some of the assessment tools. And so you can just kind of click on that, and it will bring you right to where in the program. And then I didn't mention this at the beginning. This was actually something that we put in at the very last minute before this became sort of alive for public dissemination in March. And this is just kind of an I need help button. And so if you feel like it's just you're really going through some sensitive material, and at the beginning of the platform, I'm going to end here, we do actually do some upfront loading about, listen, you might be listening to some really intimate, sensitive, vulnerable concepts that might resonate with you in provocative ways or unique ways that you haven't experienced before. And so at any point in time along in the program, if you need to stop, take a break, walk away from it, come back to it, that's perfectly okay. The program will hold your spot as to where you were. But you can also click on this I need help button. This one connects you to a suicide prevention hotline website. We've thought about maybe adding some more, but there's also the resources page at the end of module 5 that also connects you to some really valuable and some wonderful resources. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And these are contacts. So if you're interested in learning more about the program, or if you'd like to take the program and have your entire school district walk through it and think about how we might be able to kind of crunch and analyze some of the numbers, here are some contacts for you. So Sarah is a colleague of mine at UCLA. You have my information there, Hayden at usc.edu. And then Dr. Cheryl Katioka, who is also at UCLA. She was one of the original kind of partners with us in building this program. So I'm going to start my video and see if there are any questions or thoughts, reflections on anything that's come up for you today, and maybe kick this back over to Kelsey.
Steve, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, timely, and something I have been watching some things come into us from the chat box and through the questions, just comments about how wonderful this program looks and excited people are to check it out. So we do have a little bit of time left. So what questions do you all have for Steve? You can put those in the Q&A box, And we'd be happy to ask Steve while he's still with us for a few moments longer. And I don't see anything in the chat box, so I'll just keep sharing and reminding folks that the next time we will be together in this series is May 13th. And again, the time is now 9:30. If you registered for the other previous webinar, you will be automatically registered for this new one. If you missed the beginning, we are going to change the topic to psychological first aid. So Pamela and Vivian will be back with us for that final series. Also welcome you all, and I'm going to throw a curveball at Megan, but I think she can handle it. To check out our well-being series. We're doing a Northwest well-being series in our response to COVID-19, and have partnered with several organizations to help put on some support for teachers, for administrators, for families, for students. So we're working with Forefront Suicide Prevention. We are working with Northwest PBIS and DBT in schools, and well educators, and sound supports, and the Association of Washington School Principals. And again, just a huge thanks to Steve for joining us, and for all of you for taking time to be here today. We really appreciate it.
Yep. No, thank you for being here. I appreciate that this came together so nicely, and so glad that you were all here. Thanks for spending some time with me this morning, or this afternoon, or the evening, again, depending upon where you are.